a luxury cruise ship, 1,250 passengers, dinner served, ocean calm, and then, 48 miles from Shanghai, the captain turns the ship around. Not a storm, not an emergency, a bill, a $1.6 million bill. And that single moment just told you everything you need to know about where the US-China trade war is heading. Here's something most people don't realize. The biggest battles between America and China aren't happening in military drills or diplomatic summits. They're happening on the ocean, quietly, daily, in the form of fees, rerouted ships, and billion-dollar decisions made in the middle of the night by shipping executives who are desperately trying to do math that no longer adds up. This is the story of how that conflict moved from trade offices and tariff spreadsheets onto the open water, and why it's costing ordinary people on both sides of the Pacific far more than anyone wants to admit. Let's get into it. October 2025. The Riviera, a gleaming American luxury cruise vessel, was sailing through the Pacific near Japan's Honshu coastline. Everything was running on schedule. The passengers had their shore excursions booked. Shanghai was next on the itinerary. Then the company's operations team did the math. China had just activated a brand new port fee policy, effective the very next day. Under this regulation, the Riviera would be required to pay a special port surcharge of $1.64 million the moment it entered Shanghai harbor. $1.64 million. For one docking, the company made its decision in minutes. The Riviera diverted course and headed northeast, straight for Busan, South Korea. Passengers were furious. Many had booked specifically to visit Shanghai. Some had personal arrangements waiting for them. All of it, gone, replaced by an unplanned stop in a city they hadn't asked for. But here's what made this story far more significant than a disappointed cruise ship crowd. This wasn't a weather event. It wasn't a mechanical problem. It was a deliberate act of economic policy, a calculated countermove by Beijing in an escalating trade war. And to understand why it happened, we need to go back, not to last October, but to 1974. In 1974, the United States passed the Trade Act, buried inside which was a provision called Section 301. On paper, it sounds bureaucratic. In practice, it's one of the most powerful trade weapons Washington has ever built. Section 301 gives the U.S. Trade Representative the legal authority to investigate any foreign government whose trade practices are considered unfair toward American businesses, and to respond with tariffs, import restrictions, sanctions, or other punitive measures. The first time it was pointed directly at China was August 2017, Donald Trump's first term. The accusation: China was stealing intellectual property, forcing American companies to hand over their technology in exchange for market access, and flooding global markets with state-subsidized goods. What followed was the first wave of the modern U.S.-China trade war. By 2018, Washington had imposed tariffs on approximately $370 billion worth of Chinese goods. $370 billion. But here's what most people missed inside that headline number. Roughly 95% of all trade between China and the United States moves by sea, which meant that every tariff, every sanction, every trade restriction ultimately traveled through a port. And that gave the United States a very specific strategic target: China's maritime shipping industry. Part 3. Why the ocean is China's lifeline. So to understand why this matters so much, you need to appreciate how central the sea is to China's economy. China is the world's factory. We use that phrase casually, but what it actually means is this. Nearly everything manufactured in China, electronics, furniture, clothing, car parts, industrial machinery, gets to its destination by ship. Not a plane, not a truck, a ship. Right now, China maintains active shipping routes with more than 700 ports across over 200 countries. Every single day, more than 80,000 container vessels connected to Chinese companies are operating somewhere on the world's oceans. In 2024 alone, cargo shipped out of Chinese ports represented approximately 31% of the entire world's maritime cargo volume. Nearly one-third of everything moved by sea in a single year touched a Chinese port. This isn't just an economic fact. It's a strategic reality, and Washington understood it perfectly, which is precisely why the Section 301 investigation specifically targeted China's shipping and shipbuilding sectors, not just its factories. Because if you can make it harder, slower, and more expensive for China to move goods across the ocean, you've struck at something fundamental. And the early results were noticeable. Chinese vessels arriving at American ports began experiencing deliberate customs delays, inspections that added hours or days to their docking time. Subsidiaries of COSCO Shipping, China's state-owned maritime giant, were placed on American procurement blacklists. Chinese-built machinery was subjected to additional compliance requirements and stricter inspection protocols. Doing business through Chinese shipping channels was becoming more complicated, more expensive, and significantly more risky. Part 4. Trump's second term, the escalation. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in early 2025, the confrontation didn't just continue. It accelerated. In February, the administration formally expanded the Section 301 provisions. New tariffs ranging from 10 to 125% were imposed on Chinese goods. And crucially, a new policy was introduced, an additional port entry fee targeting vessels built in China, operated by Chinese companies, or with significant Chinese ownership stakes. The shipping industry was shaken. For decades, Chinese shipyards had dominated global vessel construction, not because of subsidies, but because they had become genuinely competitive on price, delivery time, and quality. South Korean and Japanese yards still held the premium tier, but for standard container ships, Chinese yards were untouchable. Overnight, that calculus changed. American companies that had been ordering ships from Chinese yards froze their orders. The share of new ship orders flowing to Chinese builders from Japan, South Korea, and European operators dropped from roughly 15% to below 5% in a matter of months. High-value contracts started flowing to yards in Ulsan and Nagasaki instead of Dalian and Shanghai. The Americans had found a pressure point, and they pressed it hard. But China was not standing still. Part 5. Beijing strikes back. For months, as the Section 301 measures reshaped global shipping, Beijing was preparing its response. On the commercial side, Chinese operators began adjusting. Companies started rerouting vessels away from American ports, reducing exposure without abandoning the U.S. market entirely. The numbers told the story. By May 2025, U.S. imports arriving from China had dropped by more than 20% compared to April, falling to approximately 637,000 20-foot equivalent units. That was the steepest single-month decline in American port-import volumes since the darkest days of COVID in March 2020. At the Port of Oakland, arrivals of Chinese-built container ships fell by 83%. At the Port of Los Angeles, the busiest container gateway in the Western Hemisphere, Chinese vessel calls dropped by approximately 71%. These were not small adjustments. These were structural shifts. And then, on October 14, 2025, China made its most direct move yet. Part 6. The $56 per ton answer. So, China's new special port fee policy was, well, surgical in its design. Basically, any vessel falling into any of these categories would now face a surcharge when entering Chinese ports. Ships owned or operated by American companies, vessels where a U.S. entity holds 25% or more ownership, ships flying the American flag, ships built in the United States, and, in a particularly pointed detail, vessels whose company chairman is an American citizen. The fee was set at $56 per ton, effective October 14, 2025, and it would rise every year until it reached $157 per ton by April 2028. For a large modern container ship, That initial fee alone could exceed $1 million for every port call. Within 3 years, the same vessel would be paying $3 to $4 million each time it docked in China. Now, China also built in deliberate exemptions. Ships built in China, exempt. Vessels entering Chinese shipyards for maintenance while unladen, also exempt. Ships primarily serving Chinese passengers as part of domestic tourism programs, eligible for special consideration. The message was pretty unmistakable. Partner with China, serve Chinese consumers, build in Chinese yards, and you'll be protected. But if you route your business through American channels, well, you'll pay. Part 7. The Scramble, Resignations and Reroutes. The announcement triggered something truly remarkable across the global maritime industry. Because the fee applied specifically to ships whose chairman was an American citizen, some companies realized there was a legal, if deeply awkward, escape route. Change the chairman before the policy kicks in. On October 13th, just 1 day before the fee took effect, a tanker company called Okeanis Eco Tankers announced that 2 of its board members, Robert Knapp and Joshua Nimser, had resigned. The company called it a routine personnel matter. Industry analysts, though, called it what it was, a regulatory dodge. 2 American executives stepping down from their board 3 days before a Chinese regulation specifically targeting ships with American executives took effect. It was legal. It was strategic. And honestly, it was a sign of just how far companies were willing to go to navigate this new landscape. But not every company had that option. Part 8. The first ship to pay, and the ship that didn't. The Manuka, a container ship operated by the Maersk Group, arrived at Ningbo port and began unloading its cargo right as the new policy went live. Before it had even finished unloading, Ningbo port issued an invoice. $630,000. By industry estimates, that was roughly half the vessel's total charter cost for the entire voyage. Half the cost of renting the ship, just gone, consumed by a single port fee. The Manuka became the first ship charged under China's new policy. The story spread through shipping industry channels like a warning flare. Operators across the Pacific immediately began running the numbers on their own exposure. Meanwhile, just 2 days later, the Spectrum of the Seas, a Royal Caribbean cruise ship, docked at a Chinese port and paid nothing. How? Royal Caribbean is headquartered in Miami. Its shares trade on the New York Stock Exchange. It's, unquestionably an American company. But the Spectrum of the Seas was built in Germany. It flies the Bahamian flag. And critically, when Chinese port authorities reviewed the passenger manifest, they found that more than 95% of passengers on that voyage were Chinese citizens, traveling as part of a domestic tourism program. Under China's exemption clause, the ship qualified for a fee waiver. Royal Caribbean paid $0. And in doing so, it demonstrated something important about how this policy was constructed. It wasn't a blunt instrument. It was precision-built to pressure genuine American commercial interests while leaving enough flexibility to protect Chinese consumers and the companies serving them. Part 9. The real cost. Who is actually paying? Let's, step back from the individual ships for a moment. Take a look at the bigger picture here. When a container ship diverts from Shanghai to Busan to avoid a port fee, the cargo doesn't just disappear. It's offloaded in South Korea, then transferred to smaller feeder vessels or trucks, and finally moved into China through these secondary channels. That process, well, it takes longer, it costs more, and those extra costs have to land somewhere. In most cases, they land on American exporters. That's the companies shipping goods into China. When their logistics costs jump unexpectedly, they try to compensate by raising prices. But Chinese buyers aren't required to accept a price increase caused by an American trade dispute. If the price goes up, the Chinese importer can simply walk away. Which means, the American exporter absorbs the loss. And just look at what's happened to America's ports. In 2024, approximately 14,300 Chinese vessels visited U.S. ports. accounting for roughly 18% of all port calls in the country. After the Section 301 measures took effect, that number dropped sharply. Industry estimates suggest that within the first 12 months of the policy's full implementation, U.S. ports collectively suffered direct and indirect losses of about $3 billion. $3 billion. In port revenues, logistics activity, and economic output. Fewer ships means fewer containers. Fewer containers means less work for longshoremen, crane operators, truck drivers, and logistics workers. Less work means reduced hours, reduced income, and in some cases, port suspensions. And then there's the consumer. When import volumes fall and shipping costs rise, the prices of goods in American stores eventually follow. Not immediately, but, reliably. That cost doesn't appear on any government invoice. It shows up quietly, embedded in the price tags of electronics, furniture, clothing, and thousands of other everyday items. That is the invisible tax of a trade war. And ordinary people pay it without ever knowing why. Part 10. The bigger game, what this is really about. So, if both sides are taking damage, and yeah, they clearly are, why does this keep escalating? Because honestly, this isn't really about port fees. For Washington, the deeper concern is strategic. Chinese shipyards now build a dominant share of the world's commercial fleet. In a world where maritime shipping underpins military logistics, energy supply, and global trade, the country that builds and controls the most ships has an enormous structural advantage. The Section 301 investigation is, in part, an attempt to slow that dominance, to create economic friction that buys time for American and allied industries to rebuild capacity they've lost over decades. For Beijing, the logic is equally strategic. China will not absorb American pressure passively. Every time Washington deploys a trade tool, Beijing will demonstrate that it has tools of its own, and honestly, the will to use them. The port fee isn't primarily about revenue. It's a signal. We control access to one of the world's most important commercial ecosystems. Don't forget that. And yet, both sides have shown they can step back. In May 2025, a temporary truce reduced the tariff pressure on both sides. After talks in Kuala Lumpur in late October, the U.S. announced it would not reimpose scheduled tariff increases when the deadline arrived. That matters. It tells us that behind the rerouted ships, the board resignations, and the billion-dollar surcharges, there is still a diplomatic channel. Still a recognition that the relationship is too large, too interconnected, too consequential to fully break. But too interconnected to break is not the same as stable. What we're living through is managed instability, a permanent low-grade economic conflict punctuated by escalations and temporary truces with no clear resolution in sight. Closing. The Riviera eventually docked in Busan. Its passengers got off, explored an unfamiliar city, and reboarded. The Manuka paid its bill, finished unloading, and sailed on. The shipping lanes of the Pacific, those invisible highways worn into the surface of the ocean by centuries of trade, are still full of vessels every single day. But something has changed. The routes those ships take are no longer determined purely by distance, weather, and fuel efficiency. They're being redrawn by politics, by policy, by the strategic calculations of two superpowers deciding, on a daily basis, how much pressure the other side can take. And caught in the middle of all of it are the people who never made those decisions, and never could. The passenger who just wanted to see Shanghai. The dock worker logging fewer hours because fewer ships are arriving. The small business owner watching their import costs climb for reasons they can't fully explain to their customers. The factory worker in Guangdong whose orders dried up overnight. Trade wars are fought in policy offices and negotiating rooms, but they're felt in kitchens, on loading docks, and on the decks of ships that used to know exactly where they were going. Here is the question that deserves to stay with you long after this video ends. In a conflict where the costs fall most heavily on the people with the least power to stop it, Who is this war actually being fought for? And can anyone afford to keep paying for it? If this opened your eyes to what's really happening in the global economy, beyond the headlines, beyond the political noise, then you already understand why this story matters. This isn't just about China and America. It's about every supply chain, every shipping route, every price tag, and every ordinary person connected to the global economy, which, whether you realize it or not, includes you. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's really driving prices and supply disruptions right now. Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one, and the conversations there are always worth joining. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the kind of analysis you're going to want to keep seeing. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story is already being written, and you'll want to be there when it breaks.